White man's burden is a great framing. Like, wait a minute, what do you mean white? Read this here. The war in Iraq was conceived by 25 neoconservative intellectuals, most of them Jewish, who are pushing President Bush to change the course of history. Two of them, journalist William Crystal and Charles Krauthammer, says it's possible. So let's switch over to a thread I saw about this here too. Like, how did they take power? How did this happen? How is it possible? The neoconservative movement was really just 24 tight-knit guys. I would replace guys with Jews there, but yeah, okay, we got it. There was 3 that were not Jewish, maybe, something like that. Anyway, which makes it, of course, overwhelmingly Jewish, considering the population, the low population number of Jews, in this case in America. Nearly the entire foreign policy establishment was opposed to invading Iraq. And of course, Iraq was just the beginning. It was, technically, it was Afghanistan first after 9/11, right? Then it was Iraq. But from there, it was, Syria, and it was Sudan, and it was Libya, and it just went on and on, right? But it was overruled by this small coterie because they had Cheney's and Rumsfeld's ears. It's the war the neoconservatives wanted. It's the war that neoconservatives marketed. Those people had an idea to sell when September 11th came, and they sold it. Then, of course, have to tie it together with the fact that there was the news that was going to happen. They might have been part of planning it. All these other questions. But let's leave that to the side for now. This is not a war that the masses demanded. This is a war of an elite. I could give you the names of 25 people, all of whom are at this moment within a 5-block radius of this office, who, if you had exiled them to a desert island a year and a half ago, the Iraq war would not have happened. Joe Klein of Time, another former supporter of the war, argues that the neoconservatives led the U.S. into a foolish war with Iraq because they were using U.S. military power, U.S. lives, and money to make the world safe for Israel. And here's more. Without AIPAC's help, they would have struggled to secure the key advisory positions that enabled them to influence top decision makers and neutralize dissenting government agencies, though the ultimate target of the lobby and the neoconservatives was Tehran. In other words, they want to go to a war with Iran, which I think is still in the works, is in the cards, is coming down the pipe. It says here, the question remains, however, how a small band of neoconservatives managed to hijack the foreign policy of the world's preeminent power. The answer lies in the salient positions that the neoconservatives hold within a vast, or the vast, institutional network of the Israel lobby. Without the lobby's help, they would have struggled to secure the key advisory positions that enabled them to influence top decision makers and neutralize dissenting government agencies, nor would they have been able to secure Congress's blessing and demoralize public opinion. The lobby's clout over Congress and its formidable organs of public influence were critical. Though the ultimate target of the lobby and the neoconservatives was Tehran, as we said, Iraq was seen as a stepping stone. But before it was defanged in the 1991 Gulf War, Iraq too was seen as a potential rival by the Israeli defense establishment. There had been plans in place since the 1970s for the Balkanization of the country, plans that were adopted and assimilated by the neoconservatives. The Iraq War was conceived in Washington, but its inspiration came from Tel Aviv. It's interesting. This is from a book here called The Road to Iraq, by the way. It's excerpts from here, but it coincides with that Haaretz piece about the author, I believe, of this book as well. Neoconservatives operated more like, here we go, right, a Männerbund than a bureaucratic organization. In other words, ethnic activism. Informal networks bound by personal allegiances and a gravitational core around a handful of figures. Yeah, they share the same race. They're all Jews. That's basically what this is. It's not hard, right? These actors value personal relationships over bureaucratic chains of command, put official information to private use, and use private information to steer official policy. They owe no allegiance to the institution. Their loyalties lie with the informal network, the FlexNet, whose close social bonds, ideological coherence, protean faculty, and infiltration of official and corporate spheres serve as a fulcrum for their influence. That's a heck of a way of saying, you can just say Jews. You can replace that whole paragraph and say, it's Jews.
Jews. It's the Jews.
The neoconservative core is a small band of ideological kin brought together by common goals, shared personal histories, and an Israel-centric worldview. They have a tendency to personalize and bypass bureaucracy. Their intense social and ideological bonds undergird their networks of think tanks, front groups, and letterhead organizations, right? This was a multi-generational path to power. In some cases, the torch were passed from father to son, as in the case of Crystal and Potterhertz, etc. Neoconservatism in the 1970s were just a couple of publications, but they went on to founding or even hijacking multiple influential institutions. The book is a white pill because it shows how a small group of people took power from behind shadows without even a mass movement or electoral constituency. To call it astroturfed is an understatement. Our advantage is that we do have a movement that Trump will bequeath to us. I'm not sure about that because, of course, largely is on board with that. He might officially say he's against war and neoconservatism and stuff like that. But anyway, the point stands. You can have a small, dedicated group of people who take over control. But of course, they wouldn't, as they admit in the publication here, they wouldn't be able to do that without AIPAC. We don't have an AIPAC. Right? They wouldn't do it without the Israeli lobby. We don't have an Israeli lobby. Those are the kinds of institutional centers of power, really, and influence that we need to have as white people. My point is, it still shows you that you can do it with a highly organized minority, because that's what they showed, right? Yes, they had all the right, they had money on their side and all that kind of things, right? But basically, we need to be more ruthless about this. But back to Banksy again, right? And back to all these anti-war activists. Why is it that so few of them are able to recognize or point out the level of Jewish activism behind it? It's always like, oh, well, it's America's fault, or even NATO or whatever, right? But it's never about them actually talking about who ideologically, have provided the underpinnings for why American foreign policy went in the direction that it had, right? And so if you're against war, right, then technically you should be against immigration, because that's a fallout of the war, as we've showed you so many times now. But the war on terror, which really started after 9/11, the groundwork for this was laid back in the 70s. Neoconservatives, Jews getting out of the Soviet Union, going over to America, etc., etc. But it displaced up to almost 60 million people, according to a Voice of America piece recently here, right? 60 million people. Where did those people go? They didn't go to other Islamic countries or other Middle Eastern, Asian countries or whatever. They went to America and Europe primarily, maybe in some cases Australia and New Zealand as well, of course. But in most cases, that's where they went. And so when you see tweets like this from our good friend Ezra Levant over at Rebel Jews, we need to deport thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. Then he set up, here we go, right? Deport Hamas.com. But Ezra, what group are disproportionately responsible for advocating for open borders in Western countries? Who brought the Hamas terrorists to our countries, Ezra? What group disproportionately are overrepresented among neocons, Ezra? After all, they are responsible for driving 49 million people out of their countries since the start of the so-called war on terror. So I keep returning back to the neocons, right? You have to talk about the neocons. You have to understand what their ethnic gripe is and why they did what they did.